Hey everyone, this is alexusadays, and we're continuing with REST API testing with Postman. And today we're going to talk about API documentation. So a lot of your testing is going to be based on the API documentation. In some companies that may be like startups, you might not have a complete or full API documentation in place, but typically before API can be used or can be shared with customers, you want to have good comprehensive API documentation that you can test against, and you want to make sure that API is working as it is described in the documentation. Otherwise, sharing API with someone without having a comprehensive documentation will cause a lot of problems because people will not going to know how to use it, what kind of responses to expect, what values are required, and what are not. All right, so it is module 6. Let's get into it. So API documentation is a guide to help developers and testers understand how to interact with an API. It usually includes base URL, the root address where the API is hosted, endpoints, specific URLs for different functions of the API, for example, users or orders, parameters, information that needs to be passed in the API request, such as query strings, headers, or pass variables. Request and response structure, explanation of the request payload and expected response formats. Error codes, common HTTP status codes, for example 200 OK for a forward not found, 500 internal server error, and their meaning in the context of the API. Developers often generate YAML or .yml or JSON files to define the structure of an API. These files describe everything about the API, endpoints, request response types, parameters, security, and more. Tools like Swagger and Reddoc can then generate interactive documentation from these files. Here's an example with the Swagger. We will see some endpoints here, and here's an example with API doc. So we're going to take a look at both of those. We're going to take a look at the pet store documentation for the API, and we're going to take a look at Restful-booker documentation for the API. One thing that you might find while you do an API testing is curl. Curl is a command line tool used to send HTTP requests, allowing users to interact with APIs. The format of a curl request generally looks like this. So there's a command opening that says curl, then you have -x, which specifies the HTTP method being used here, so get, post, put, or delete. Then you have URL and H that adds headers, for example, content type or authorization. And you have, after you have the body that sends data with the request. So curl is often included in API documentation to show how to interact with an API directly from the command line. Many API docs provide curl examples to help developers quickly test endpoints without needing an application. If you're working against the UI, let's say your developers are working on some web page and you will see API interactions going in and out in the network tab in DevTools, you can right click that and you can actually copy the API as curl, and then you can grab it and paste it in your tool. For example, you can import in Postman, and then you can actually have from that curl copy, you can have an API tool like Postman sending the same request out. We will be covering all that as we go forward. Okay, so when you will start working with testing API at your company, there will be API documentation, right? So let's take a look at some of the examples that are available online, like open APIs that are available. So one is petstore.swagger.io, and you can see the link is actually in the file for the module. Now here, for example, we can get pets using this API. You can see that there are post requests, put requests, get requests, delete requests, and so on. So let's grab, let's say, the very first one. So upload an image. That's the description of this request. Post method. The link will be the URL for the endpoint. So pet ID that has to be provided, and upload image. So if we open it up, now we can see that, okay, so here's a required field, pet ID. You need to provide that. You can also provide additional metadata to pass to the server, and you need to provide a file to upload for the image. And if the request is successful, you will see a respond with a status code, with a code. So the status code will be 200, and you will see code 0, type string, and message coming as a response. There will be a response body. Let's see, there's another post for creating a path itself, right? So here you have a body that you need to provide when create a path. And you can also see if you look at the model. So right now the body is marked as required to do post request like a whole body, but if you go from an example value into the model, you will see also fields that are required when you creating requests. Like you can create a request without other bodies, but you must provide those that are required. So you'll have to provide name, and you will have to provide photo URL if you're creating new path. And if you have responses that are invalid, something is missing, you'll have like 405. For example, if you try to create a pet without a name or without the photo, right? Now let's take a look at put request. So put is updating, right? So here again, you need to provide a body that you're trying to update in the model. So again, you need to have a name and photo URL. And some errors that you might get back for 100 if there was an invalid ID. And I'm surprised that here ID is not a required field. Most likely it should be required. Otherwise, I'm not sure how can you update a path. So maybe because there's an error that will give you 400 invalid ID. So this is like part of the actual implementation, right? So path not found if you provide ID that doesn't exist. Invalid ID if something not expected, maybe different data type, like you can see there's an integer expected and you provide like a string maybe, and other validation exceptions are possible to trigger with invalid update attempt. Now we have get, and for example, you can find pet by ID or you can find it by status. You can see there's also crossed out find by tag, so probably this is not implemented here, right? Now let's find by ID. So all you really need is to send the ID of the path using the endpoint, and then you'll get back the path. So if request is successful, you get a 200 code and the response body. You can also see there's some required fields that should be coming back. So you can get a request, you can get a response back without any of those fields, but name and photo URL has to be provided. Now, again, I think there's a little bit of an issue with this API documentation because ID is not marked as required. You see there's a little asterisk here that means it's required, but ID is not. So I would say, so when you will be testing API, you will be encountering things like that. Those things are worth a discussion, right? Then most likely this ID will be the one that you provided in the request, but I don't see how it might be an optional field. Okay, so then you have a 400 if there was an invalid ID provided, or 404 if you provide ID of a pet that does not exist. And then we have a delete here. For example, you can provide a pet ID, and you will actually going to have a header with API key and the pet ID, and then you will have a response 404 pet not found, and 400 if invalid ID is supplied. Now, I don't believe this is, maybe they will have a 404 pet not found when you delete it as well, but typically I think this request would is missing an acknowledgement like 204 or something, where pet is actually deleted and operation went through like okay, right? So like 204 status code would indicate no content, right? So if you send a delete request and there was something present and then you deleted it, typically you'll get back like 204 no content. So as a confirmation that it was actually deleted. And then there's some other endpoints like store and users. There are models for the API. Like we can see a model of the pet, of the response body, and what you can get back. So you have multiple categories here. So like you have ID, which is integer, so you can verify data types. Another ID here was in the category and the name for that category. You have the name of the pet, with the example being doggy. URL for the photo. Now you have photo URL here was in the string. You have tags. ID name. So you can kind of expand. This is sort of a look of the schema of that particular response, right? Where you have data types and the structure, what to expect when path is coming back. All right, so that is Swagger, and Swagger is a pretty popular tool, something that you will deal most likely when you work in the API. But there are other tools, there are other solutions available. But once you work with one a little bit, you will understand others as well. Once you have like a general understanding what to expect from API documentation. Here is another one called Restful-booker. So it's an API documentation for the Playground API. So you can also play with this one. You can see there's authorization token to use this API, and here how you can get the token. It's a post request going to this URL, and there's also an example of a curl for that particular request. So you need to provide the link. You need to provide the header, and then you need to provide a body, and within the body you need to have username admin and password 123, and then it will give you back a response. So you will have a 200 response coming back with a token value. Then you can use that token to do other requests. Like this is like authorization for your API, right? Same thing, like if you try to log in into an email, in order to see what's inside the email, you need to provide username and password. Same idea is here with the API. You provide username and password, you get back token, then that token is used for all your other API requests, right? And this one format, you can see it's a little bit different, but you have a post here at the top, says what type of request in the link. There's an example with curl, pretty extensive. And then also explanation what can be in each field. So in the header, you have content type. In the body, you have username and password. And what data type is being sent here. So string means it's all text. And you have a response example here also. So what type of API documentation you will be using at your company will completely depend on the place where you work at. But typically, you want the API documentation to be comprehensive, and you want to make sure that your API documentation is matching what your API actually does. So the data types that you get in actual API responses are matched in the documentation. API doesn't work if you don't send the required values, you get proper error messages, and so on. So let's take a look at some of the things here in this API. So you can get a booking by ID, right? So if you provide, so it also says here optional, optional, optional. Get booking IDs. Return the ID of all. Okay, so you're getting all of the IDs of the bookings here with this request. And as a response, you will get a booking ID of all the requests, of all the bookings being done already. Now, you can get a particular booking, but then you need to provide an ID. So if you want to know everything about booking one, you need to provide an ID in this request. Here's a curl example of the request going out, and some headers that you can see with it. The URL parameter is your ID that you're sending. The data type is string, and as a response, you'll have a code 200. You'll have a first name, last name, total price, deposit paid for this booking, and so on. There's also variations like of the responses. So this is your typical JSON body that you would see, but there's some variations. You can see it in XML, or you can see it in URL, right? Just like that. So JSON, this is something you're going to be working most of the time. So JSON is just getting familiar with it is pretty good way to start, right? Now you have a create booking. You can post with all this information inside of your request. Again, this is curl showing you the example, but you can use this body in Postman, for example, or any other tool. Interesting thing here in booking, I will show you. Now you will see you can delete here booking again by the ID, but the response that you get back is 200. 200 is not a typical response, and there is a success response 200, but then it says default HTTP 201, and it says 201 created for a delete request. So now this is an obvious bug, like if you know the requests, responses, the status codes that you typically get, so it should be 204. So there's a bug in documentation says success 200, and then in the response it says 201 created. It should be 204 here and 204 here. So when you will be doing API testing, you can also look out for things like that. You know, the standards for the API implementation, understanding the status codes, which are status codes are typical to which methods, the responses that you get. Yeah, so it's not only testing API against the documentation, it's also testing documentation itself, making sure that it is, it has proper standards and for the implementation of the documentation API itself. Okay, so I think that's it. And going forward, we're going to install Postman, and we'll start getting into some of those APIs, doing the requests, and actually creating test cases for those. This was Alex, you say days. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.